Chapter 7. Unspeakable Sightseeing. The party from the Albion Imperial Museum, the Doctor, Romana, Lou Halberd, Nathan Ivan and Timmy Cowley, all stood forlornly on the vast expanse of concrete which formed Buda Aerodrome's main landing strip on the planet of Hungaria. With them stood an unusually introspective-looking Rongad the Argand. All around them were piled their luggage and other belongings, including the TARDIS. It also included one extra item, the chilled casket of Penny Cowley. "Well, that all turned out splendidly," Lou exclaimed with profound annoyance. "Who could have known they'd throw us off the ship after your little wing walking display?" This last remark was aimed at the Doctor. The Doctor simply frowned and continued to think. Finally, Romana felt the need to prompt him. "What now, Doctor?" He still frowned, deep in thought, but flashed her a brief smile of appreciation. "Now we split the party," he said determinedly, before rounding on Professor Halberd. "Lou, you and the others from the museum must try and exert whatever influence you have to get us back on board the A36 before it departs in 2 days. Whatever happens here, we must move on to Cairo post-haste. If Captain Povey cannot be convinced or overridden, we must get the next available ship to take us onwards. Oh, and don't forget to have our equipment transported too." Lou glared at the Doctor, distinctly peeved. "What a charmingly simple task," she said wearily. "And what, pray tell, will you and Romana be doing?" The Doctor looked shocked. "They know you're not Fred," he cried to Romana. Romana rolled her eyes while Lou did the same. "We're not deaf, you know. You haven't referred to her as Fred once since we left the museum." "And I am a detective," Nathan pointed out proudly. Timmy remained grim and unresponsive, drowned by grief. "You still haven't answered my question," Lou insisted. The Doctor inclined his head graciously. "You're quite right, of course. While we are stuck here on Hungaria, it seems sensible to make best use of our time. We shall go to Visegrad Castle, Nugati's ancestral home. With luck, although that has been somewhat lacking of late, we might just track down our sinister Doctor and possibly the stolen scarab. At the very least, we might uncover more information as to what exactly he is planning." Nathan looked a little uncomfortable with these final words, but it went unnoticed, or at least unchallenged. Instead, the Doctor nodded towards Rongad. "And I have no doubt our Argond friend here with all his skin or blood at play will insist on joining us." Rongad held up both hands towards the Albion members of the party apologetically, then beckoned the 2 Time Lords to follow him. He only led them about 10 yards away from the rest of the group, just enough distance to give a modicum of privacy. "I can't go with you," he said quietly, unusually downcast and serious. "Ah, a great pity," the Doctor replied with polite sorrow. "I'm sure we'll be able to manage just the 2 of us." Romana glared at the Doctor before addressing Rongad. "You mean you're not coming with us to Visegrad Castle, right?" she said with a puzzled frown. Rongad shook his head sadly. "No," he responded plainly. "I mean I can't carry on with you at all. I've got to find a ship out of this system, either from here directly or more likely, given it will need to be non-Albion passage back to Albia, then a connection from there." Romana shook her head in disbelief. "But why?" she cried. "Why would you give up your pursuit of Dr. Nugati now, when we're so close? I thought tracking him down and preventing him from misusing your genetic material, your blood, was the most important thing to you." Rongad smiled sadly. "Not necessarily the most important thing to me. But in any case, other priorities have arisen. Nugati has launched agents out into the universe, agents who are either bulk entities or closely aligned with them. As such, the whole universe may be easily accessible to them, and even if they are limited to conventional interstellar travel, if we're that lucky, they're still out there on the hunt, hunting for my people, Here, Rongad paused to let the significance of his words sink in. The doctor remained stony-faced, difficult to read. Romana looked increasingly dismayed as the reality and implications of his words sank in. If any of my people still exist out there, I have to find them. I have to warn them, protect them, put them on their guard against these bulk servants. Even if Nugati is gone, even if you two deal with him and the problems here, those bulk creatures will still be out there. And who says his death will stop them? They might well fancy his plan on its own merits and carry on regardless. No, I'm afraid I have to go. The doctor nodded once gravely. Romana's head slowly fell as she shook it sadly. I understand, the doctor said simply. Romana looked up, frowning. I suppose I have to too. I can't argue with your logic or your sense of duty, she said wearily. Rongad held out a hand towards the doctor, who took it and shook it a couple of times, saying, It may not have always been a pleasure, but I can't deny you have your uses. Rongad chuckled, shaking his head. High praise indeed. When all's said and done, it was fun. Now he offered that same hand to Romana. She took it and shook it firmly, holding it a few moments longer than the doctor had. You will be missed, she said. Rongad nodded once, then let go. He turned, shifting his backpack and shoulder bag to make them more comfortable. Then he walked off towards Buda Aerodrome's main building and never looked back. Romana watched as he slowly receded from view, swinging his sword cane as he went. She glanced forlornly down at her own identical stick. It can be hard losing a companion, the doctor offered, in a tone which was, at least for him, a little gentler than usual. Romana's eyes snapped up, and her gaze bore into him like furious heat rays. He was not your... Her angry, almost shouted words were cut short by Romana herself. She continued to stare intensely at the doctor, but something about her gaze slowly shifted. The intensity remained, but subtly morphed from ire to scrutiny. Finally, she spoke again. Yes, perhaps you would understand after all, she said more calmly. Her anger had far from evaporated entirely, but it was clear she had been thinking deeply about many things. The two Time Lords remained staring at one another for several long moments. At last, the doctor broke the silence. Will you come with me to Visegrad Castle? He asked. Romana snorted once. Of course. What did you think I was going to do? We can't all go abandoning our quest, and we certainly can't have you going it alone. Can you imagine the mess? The doctor nodded once with a twisted, needled smile. They both made their way out of the spaceport in search of cabbies. Visegrad Castle, it turned out, lay several kilometers to the north of Buda, which itself only truly began a few kilometers north of the aerodrome. As a consequence, the two Time Lords initially traveled via combustion-engined cabby through dense forest. And what a forest! What are those? Romana asked in awe. Many of the trees were a familiar mixture of brown and green, while still more were clothed in silver foliage, creating an overall woodland picture which would have not looked out of place on Earth or Gallifrey. But it was not these trees which had so caught Romana's attention. Every so often, interspersed at random among the more usual types of trees, rose enormous unearthly cousins to those plants, rising 2 or 3 times their height, dwarfing all around them. Their trunks were more a charcoal grey, almost black, while their broad leaves were an autumnal rusty brown. Wrapped around many of these giants were vines of a similar coloration, charcoal tendrils and russet foliage, almost as if these parasites were trying to blend in with their hosts. Oh, those? The doctor said casually, nodding to the nearest ruddy-topped behemoth. They are ironroot trees, so called because their roots, and indeed their entire frame, are as tough as iron. The creepers you see are called vampire vines and share similar properties. To vampires? Romana asked, a tiny bit troubled. The doctor chuckled, shaking his head. Only if you're an ironroot tree yourself. Otherwise, you're safe. No, their tendrils share a similar durability to their hosts. Romana nodded. I suppose we have landed in early autumn to judge from the turning colours of the leaves, she observed. The doctor shook his head. Late spring, actually. The ironroots and vines are evergreen, in fact, although I suppose ever-rusty might be a better name. Romana frowned, and they both subsided back into silence, continuing to watch the glorious scenery as it drifted past the cabbie's windows. Now they began to pass the odd scattered habitation, cottages, mansions, and even one castle. Most of the newer builds they saw were planted firmly on the ground in a fairly conventional manner. By newer, this probably extended back at least a couple of 100 years, judging by their styles of construction and general wear and tear. There was a distinctly earthly Middle European influence to their heavy wooden and stone architecture. The smaller ones often wattle and daub or timber-framed builds, though some employed brick or stone in presumably more wealthy abodes. However, Romana leaned closer to the window when the first building appeared in the style which gave the planet its name. "They're built on iron-root platforms," she exclaimed, pointing. The doctor inclined his head in agreement. "Indeed they are. The more aged, even ancient constructions are raised in that fashion." In spite of the doctor's offhand manner, the method of construction of these mammoth feats of architectural suspension were undeniably impressive. For example, one ancient fortified mansion they passed was suspended a full 10 meters above the ground. 4 vast iron-root trunks looked as though they had been driven into the earth and rocks beneath, each one corresponding to the corners of the building itself. These natural pillars had been largely cleared of their branches, although a few stubs remained here and there where they had only been truncated, so to speak. From these few stumps of branches, vampire vine tendrils, similarly stripped of their foliage, had been strung between the 4 trees. This web of former climbing plants supported the main platform, obviously formed from the numerous branches which had been hewn from the trees and repurposed. It was on this iron-root timber platform that the mansion itself had been constructed from time-worn blocks of stone, ancient more conventional timber and slate. A later stone staircase had been built up to the front door, but from the cleanliness of its brickwork, it was clearly a much newer addition. "You must admit this is incredible," Romana insisted. "I mean, how did the ancient Hungarians move those tree trunks, then drive them into the ground? And the toughness of the timber must be immense to support such a weighty construction. How on Gallifrey did they even cut through it?" The doctor smiled an almost cheeky smile as he raised his finger. "Ah, you see, they probably didn't drive the trunks into the ground. As I understand it, buildings of this nature were by necessity built wherever iron-root trees were already growing in a convenient pattern. Then they simply had to clean the trunks of excess timber, as you see here. As to how the ancient Hungarians managed this, they stand out among the myriad races and species of our universe as being the only one to have invented the acetylene torch before the wheel." Romana rolled her eyes at the doctor, but did not quite succeed in suppressing a smile. They passed on into Buda itself, a city of some size straddling a monstrously broad river. The buildings here were often grand and tall, fine stonework and glass on display for all to see. Even here, some, the more ancient, were suspended or hung, while constructions from the last few centuries were usually fixed to the pavements. The Time Lords got an excellent view of the river, seeming to be in full flood at this time of year, as they crossed one of the magnificent vine-linked bridges arching between the 2 halves of the city. "Have you seen the Duna River before?" their driver asked. The doctor and Romana both shook their heads, awed into silence as they took in all the magnificent sights before them. In time they passed beyond the city and were once more surrounded by forest. From the occasional glimpses of Upsilon Orionis through the trees, they could tell it was late afternoon. After following a relatively narrow, winding and frequently potholed road, they finally popped out into a small village of almost entirely suspended cottages and houses. These were gathered around a vast, heavy stone fortress, this too suspended between multiple iron-root trunks. "Visegrad Castle," the driver supplied, somewhat redundantly. The village had been signposted, as was the staircase to the castle itself. The doctor and Romana paid the driver, thanking him as they did so, then stood looking up at the dark stoned castle looming over them. Behind them the cabbie puttered off back in the direction of Buda. "Perhaps we should chat with the villagers," Romana suggested. "Check out the lie of the land." The doctor looked round at the few shops, taverns and other businesses and dwellings scattered around the open cobbled area in front of the castle. Doubtless this area served as a village square, or marketplace, although at that moment it was largely deserted. All the buildings surrounding them were constructed in the raised style, each served by steep wooden-framed stairs, ending with a small drawbridge to their front door. 2 or 3 shop owners and the like could be seen sitting at the bottom of their own steps, looking out idly at the square before them, possibly looking for trade but largely looking bored. "An excellent idea, Romana," the doctor agreed. "We might at least find out if Nugati is known to be home before we try storming the castle. And who knows what other useful information we might uncover." With that, he started off towards the nearest shop with a visible owner. This turned out to be a bakery, and the baker stood up to greet them as the doctor and Romana approached. "Hello, my dear lady," the doctor said to her as they arrived. "We were wondering if we might purchase some of your famous Visegrad bread before visiting your equally renowned castle." The baker's mouth fell open, her large Hungarian eyes expanding almost to the size of saucers. She turned on her heels, one hand flying to her puffy white baker's hat, the other hitching up her long apron and dress beneath, before she began to run up the steps towards her shop. As she ran, she cried, "They are going to the castle. The ancient evil has returned. They shall bring the curse upon us all. Fly, flee, bolt all the doors." With these final words, the baker reached her miniature drawbridge, ran across it, and through her own front door, then did just that. Meanwhile, those few people visible around the square had taken up similar cries of, "The curse!" and "The ancient evil." Soon the villagers had bolted their entrances against all comers. Even the buildings where the owners had already been inside showed signs of fearful preparations, curtains closed, shutters slammed, and still more bolts thrown. The Time Lords were now utterly alone. "Well, that went well," Romana said, nodding with feigned satisfaction. The doctor's own head bobbed in vigorous agreement. "Oh yes, far better than usual, I'd say," he enthused, even flashing Romana a conspiratorial grin as he finished. He then began to mount the stairs to the baker's door, and Romana followed. The doctor stopped just short of walking onto the drawbridge itself, remaining on the small platform formed by the top step. Romana stood next to him, both covered by a pretty wooden roof clearly designed to keep visitors dry had it been raining. As it was, the afternoon was still pleasant, sunny, and dry. "Just in case the drawbridge is also a trapdoor," the doctor whispered to Romana behind his hand by way of an explanation for their stopping. The rapid nodding of Romana's head signaled her wholehearted approval of his action. "Excuse me," the doctor now called out towards the firmly closed door, "but we really did just want a little bread, and perhaps some guidance." A shrill voice shrieked out from behind the door. "You'll get none from us, Save. Leave now before you damn us all. You'll bring the curse upon everyone here. Go, now!" The door opened a crack, and something was thrown towards the 2 Time Lords. It bounced along the drawbridge and stopped just short of their feet. It was a loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper. Romana bent down, picked it up, opened the wrapper and broke off a piece. Then she ate it. "It is rather good," she admitted, passing another chunk to the doctor. "You see," he replied cheerfully, "already our investigations have yielded tangible results. Oh, yes, it is good." His last remark was made with a mouthful of famous Visegrad bread. They made their way back down the shop's stairs and walked towards those belonging to the castle. "So the direct approach, then?" Romana inquired. The doctor nodded. "It seems we have little choice. Still, I've always said it was my preferred technique." Romana allowed a single chuckle to puff through her nose. Now the 2 Time Lords climbed magnificent broad stone steps leading up to the suspended castle's own lowered drawbridge. As they climbed, the doctor gazed at the empty space under the castle, which at ground level was covered by a lawn and shade-tolerant plants. "At least they won't have a dungeon," the doctor noted. Romana raised a skeptical eyebrow. "They won't have an underground dungeon," Romana corrected. The doctor grimaced, but mimed his acceptance of her point. They reached the drawbridge and began to cross. It was then that they saw a figure waiting in the entrance facing them. His features were typical of any Albion, Cairoan, or Hungarian they had so far encountered. Full lips, even fuller eyes, and a tiny nose. The 2 Time Lords guessed he was the head of the castle staff since, much like Sir Arthur Buchan's manservant Germain back on Albia, he was suited as befitted his respected station. Unlike Germain, however, this servant's attire had a much more rural look about it, the suit being cut from a thick, coarse, tweed-like material. His sturdy brown boots also looked more suited to tramping through the woods than Germain's dapper patent leather shoes ever could. "Good day, sir, madam," he said politely, but ever so slightly warily, as the doctor and Romana reached him. "How may I help you?" As they were fast becoming used to in this star system, they had been addressed in perfect English, albeit with a Hungarian accent. Both Time Lords were relieved to note that the alabaster skin of this Hungarian had the usual healthy shine associated with his species, unlike other lackeys of Nugati they had run into in Northwestwood Cemetery and on board the A-36 spaceship. The doctor bowed his head graciously to the man while withdrawing the psychic paper wallet from his pocket. "I very much think it is how may we help you?" The doctor began with his best approximation to a friendly smile, flipping the psychic paper open as he did so. "I am the doctor, and this is Romana. We have both been sent by the Albion Imperial Museum to help evaluate and authenticate items in Dr. Nugati's personal collection." The head servant frowned at the psychic paper and scratched behind his right ear thoughtfully. He then used those same fingers to smooth his longish sandy hair back over that same ear. "My name is Akos," he said finally, "steward of Visegrad Castle, and first in service to Norbert Nugati, hereditary Baron of Visegrad. He made no mention of such a visit?" The doctor spread his hands wide in apology. "Ah, of course, how thoughtless of me. You are no doubt aware of the generous contributions Dr. Nugati has made to the Albion Imperial Museum, yes?" Akos nodded his head, his face still grave and thoughtful. "Well, in gratitude, Sir Arthur Buchan, curator in charge of expeditions, promised museum resources be allocated to help catalogue the good doctor's own impressive collection. And so here we are, the payment of debts owed, so to speak." The steward of Visegrad Castle still looked less than convinced. "Perhaps if you asked Dr. Nugati himself, it would make things easier," Romana suggested, hoping to shore up the doctor's pretense. Akos continued to frown and scratched once more behind his right ear, lost in thought. "Unfortunately, Dr. Nugati is unavailable at the moment," he explained. "He only today left the castle, and I am unsure of when he will return." Romana leaned towards the doctor and whispered behind her hand, "It seems the Phoenix failed." The doctor inclined his head subtly in agreement. Romana made a great show of disappointment. "Oh, that is such a pity. Still, while we're here, we should probably make best use of the time and get to work." A low grumble came from the chief servant. "I'm not sure this is the best use of your time or mine," he said slowly. "However," he continued, nodding towards the doctor's psychic paper, now lowered but still clutched by the Time Lord, "your paperwork seems in order. There is little I can do to stop you, it seems. Please, follow me." While Akos's final invitation was grudging, it was honestly given, and he stepped to one side to allow them to enter the castle. The doctor and Romana walked through the impressive iron-studded wooden double doors. They were arched towards their tops, where they would meet when closed, and the entrance they usually filled was 3 meters wide, while perhaps half a meter taller than that at their midpoint. Akos followed the Time Lords through that same entrance, then turned to the leftmost door, slamming it shut. He then repeated this action with the right door before finally bolting them. The doctor and Romana looked at one another with raised eyebrows. Their apprehension did not go unnoticed by the castle's steward. "It is just a local tradition," he explained a little awkwardly. "Many centuries ago, these lands were plagued by wild and ferocious beasts. They are long gone, but the traditions and superstitions remain. We always bolt the doors when new guests arrive to ensure the safety of all." The doctor and Romana both nodded their understanding, wearing friendly smiles, trying their utmost to eke out as much cooperation from him as possible. For the first time, the two Time Lords stared around the vast entrance hall of Visegrad Castle. At the far end of the room, a grand, broad single staircase led gently up to an equally expansive landing serving the floor above. To either side of these sumptuous stone steps lay broad corridors leading off to the interior of the castle of this level, while within the hall itself still more inlaid and decorated wooden doors dotted the walls, giving further access to the ground floor chambers. Grand though the castle undoubtedly was, it was something other than the architecture which drew the attention of both Romana and the doctor. There were dead animals everywhere. That is not to say the floors were strewn with carcasses, like some ill-maintained abattoir. Nevertheless, there was a dizzying array of stuffed animals about the place. Many were simply the heads of animals mounted to numerous plaques around the walls themselves. Still more were freestanding, kept in lifelike poses at various points around the floors. Morbid and somewhat grotesque as these displays doubtless were, they did at least give a glimpse into the impressive array of creatures native to Hung area, even if a more animated introduction might have been preferable. There was clearly much convergent evolution at work here, much like that which they had already witnessed on Albia, or in the few pictures they had seen of Cairo. Many Earth analogues were on display: bears, wolves, foxes, big cats, boars, or at least creatures very similar to these. There was still more which did not have direct equivalents. One mounted head looked like it might have been a horse, but for the single horn in the center of its forehead. In that regard, it had more in common with the horses of Levithia. Another mounted head had a distinctly feline appearance, and yet bore a hawk-like beak. "Quite the menagerie," Romana remarked, "although I think I prefer to enjoy them still moving." The doctor nodded, grunting his agreement as he continued to examine the rest of the entrance hall. There were several medieval-looking suits of armor dotted around, weapons of a similar vintage mounted on racks along the walls or in cabinets, at least when there was sufficient space between dead animals. A couple more servants were cleaning and polishing a few of these military ornaments, seemingly without much enthusiasm. The taxidermy was positively unloved and received no such care at this time. "I suppose you will want to see the master's ancient Cairoan exhibits?" Akos asked politely, but with little exuberance. The doctor waggled his head noncommittally, while Romana was completely oblivious to the servant's remark. She was transfixed by one of the mounted heads. It was the odd part puma, part osprey chimera. As Romana approached it, one of the other servants turned on the lights. The late afternoon was turning towards evening, and the last rays of the sun were fading fast. Although these artificial lights were electric, or some similar moderately advanced technology, they appeared less reliable than those they had encountered on Albia, and they flickered intermittently. The shadows they cast seemed to dance and come alive. It may have been this effect which prompted Romana's next remark. "I know they are, unfortunately, stuffed," she said with a curious air, reaching one hand towards the head of the puma osprey, "but they do seem quite lifelike." Barely had these words left her mouth when a shriek rent the air. The beak of the bird feline snapped mere millimeters from Romana's fingers as she yanked her hand back, leaping away a few feet in the process. "Be careful what you wish for," the doctor cried, rushing up beside Romana. "What the devil do you mean?" Romana cried back. "I never wished for my fingers to become bird food." "Well, you said you preferred to enjoy them still moving," he pointed out. "Obviously not like this," she cried exasperatedly. Looking around them, it was clear the mounted bird feline was not the only stuffed animal coming alive. Virtually every creature on display was beginning to move, low growls and grumbles beginning to emanate from many of them. One bear and one lynx already stood between the two Time Lords and the bolted main doors. The doctor grabbed a nearby antique halberd from its stand, while Romana drew her nth material swordstick. While the menagerie slowly closed on their position, they could not help but notice the servants were still in the room with them. Admittedly, the two who had been cleaning were now leaning on a nearby wall and a display case, attempting to discreetly keep out of the way, but they had gone no further than that. Similarly, the steward of Visegrad Castle, Akos, had barely moved from where the Time Lords had last seen him, and he was still relatively close by. "So," the doctor said with sneering, forced bravado, "you and the other servants plan to watch the entertainment, eh? No doubt you'll finish the job of tearing us to pieces if these unfortunate creatures fail." Akos looked aghast. "We are not like these things. We are alive, just like you. We're Nugati's servants, true, but we're not his hired assassins." Romana looked contemptuously at him. "You expect us to believe you knew nothing about these things? Their sudden reanimation was a complete surprise, I suppose." The servant looked at his feet. "No. We knew Nugati had used his accursed concoctions on these dead things long ago. Knew he had left them with basic instructions to kill anyone not of the household. But we did not make them, and we will not help them." "Then help us," the doctor pleaded. As he said this, he swung his halberd towards a nearby boar who had crept quite close. It snorted and took a step back, but not very far. "We cannot," Akos wailed. Among their instructions is to treat any who might aid you, any who try to obstruct them, as no different from yourselves. We'd be torn apart right along with you." Romana suddenly remembered something. She sheathed her weapon, then reversed it. Using it as a club, she swung the heavy brass pommel at the snarling head of a wolf. She struck true, and the beast rolled away from her, whimpering. "Bad wolf!" Romana barked at it, but all too soon it had found its feet again. A small amount of purplish ichor oozed from a gash above its left eye. "So," she hissed at Akos, "you're fine, just as long as you do nothing and watch us die, right?" Akos looked downcast and ashamed. The doctor's face brightened. "Would you still answer any questions we ask?" he said. Akos looked puzzled. "But of course," the servant agreed, amenable but confused. "And if we asked you to take us anywhere, would you show us the way?" At this point, both the doctor and Romana swung their respective weapons, moving back to back as they did so. They then gracefully rotated on the spot in order to exchange opponents. "Of course," Akos agreed again, almost cheerfully. "But what if the creatures count that as obstructing them?" Romana pointed out. "Did you have to mention that?" The doctor hissed at her under his breath. Akos contemplated this for a few moments. "These things are dull-witted and limited in their understanding. Unless I actively get in their way, they probably won't see it as obstruction. In any case, it's a chance I'm prepared to take," he assured them. "Good man," the doctor responded with somewhat forced cheerfulness. "Now answer me this," he continued, poking at the wolf Romana had previously been fighting with his halberd. "Is Dr. Nugati a neat and orderly man? A place for everything and everything in its place?" Akos considered this for a moment. "I would say that fits the master very well," he agreed. "Excellent!" the doctor exclaimed, delighted. By now he and Romana had been forced to stand upon the lowest step of the grand staircase by the encroaching mass of snarling, barking, yelping creatures. "Can you take us to where he keeps his ancient Chiroan collection?" The steward of Visegrad Castle nodded enthusiastically. "Naturally. It's up the stairs behind you. I'll show you the way." He dashed past the revived beasts and waited for the two Time Lords to follow him a couple of steps above them. "Doctor, this hardly seems like the time to keep an appointment," Romana insisted with concern. The doctor shook his head. "Nugati is something of a control freak, and exhibits certain extremes of orderliness, a systematic bent, if you will. His stuffed animals seem most prominently on display here in the entrance hall. He may have one or two more in the corridors, but it is highly unlikely he would mix them in with his Chiroan artifacts. That wouldn't do at all, as I said. A place for everything and everything in its place." Romana's eyes widened at the doctor. "That's actually brilliant. If there are few or none of these animated trophies in there, we might actually stand a chance of securing and defending the place." "Impressive thinking," she conceded, nodding. The doctor made the best display of modesty he could manage. "Ah, well, you know, I have my moments." As he said this, a bear's clawed paw whizzed past his head mere millimeters from his left ear. "Will you two hurry up and come with me?" Akos cried out in alarm, "or you'll have no more moments." With that, all three dashed up the stairs, a wave of hunting victims in their wake, out for revenge. As predicted, there were one or two animals on the loose in the corridors above. They made no move to impede Akos as he ran past them. He was known to them. However, the doctor and Romana had to bludgeon and poke their way through to keep up with him. They mounted another smaller flight of stairs to the floor above. When they arrived, they found more corridors which now seemed bereft of animated animal corpses, as they had hoped. As it turned out, not entirely bereft. A raven-like bird, another product of Upsilon Orionis parallel evolution, flew glassy-eyed and screeching straight for the doctor's face. He froze in his tracks, the traumatic associations of that image robbing him of any other thoughts and paralyzing him with fear and grief. There was a thwack, and the crow flew back up the corridor like a baseball. This was precisely how Romana had hit it with her sword cane. She inclined her head once at the doctor, with a smile of satisfaction. The doctor nodded his thanks back to her with a twisted, strained smile of his own. Akos threw open a heavy set of double doors about halfway along the corridor ahead of them. "Quick! In here! It's the Chiroan exhibition room." They all hurried into the room and slammed the doors behind them. Each door had a bolt which could be lowered into the ground, and so Romana and the doctor took one apiece and did so. Only then did they turn to examine the room itself. The display space was quite generous, a rectangular room with a high-angled ceiling formed by part of the castle roof itself. The roof was not slate or stone as they had expected, based upon what they had seen from outside. This one room had had its roof replaced by a pitched one of glass panes supported by an intricate iron framework, essentially a giant skylight. By now the sky had darkened almost to black, and the first few evening stars were beginning to peek through. The space was still well enough illuminated, though, as some particularly high-end lighting, at least by Hungarian standards, had been installed. Unlike most of the rest of the castle, it was bright and did not flicker. And there was much to be seen and admired on shelves or in glass display cases scattered around the room. Numerous artifacts of ancient Cairoan origin. Indeed, the entire chamber could easily have formed part of the Albion Imperial Museum itself. However, it was one artifact alone which drew the absolute and undivided attention of the two Time Lords. In the very center of the room there was a shallow dais, about 6 feet square but rising only 6 inches from the floor itself. On this modest pedestal, standing on one end with its lid removed, was an eerily familiar sight. It was yet another sarcophagus. The doctor and Romana approached it cautiously. It did not seem active or unusual at this time, but they knew better than to take anything for granted. Standing now before it, they could see its wooden floor, covered in pictogram writing as was every other surface inside the coffin. But most importantly, it did not consist of black, oily smoke. "Look at the inscriptions," Romana said, pointing towards the head of the casket. A subset of the symbols had been burnt, as if branded by a hot iron. The doctor reached in and scratched it with his right index finger. He withdrew it, and without once licking it, examined the substantial quantity of carbonized wood adhering there, and also jammed under his fingernail. "I would say this has been burnt quite recently," he concluded. "I suppose we know how Dr. Nugati so recently departed Visegrad Castle," Romana observed. "No doubt," the doctor concurred. "It's a pity we can't use this to follow him." "Why not?" Romana asked. "I mean, we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. Pursue Nugati while at the same time avoid our animal friends outside?" The doctor raised an eyebrow, accompanied by another twisted grin. "Haven't you stoned enough crows today?" he asked. No, he continued. "I have to question the wisdom of your plan. Even if we could figure out how to operate this device, without accidentally setting fire to it, for example, we would still have no idea if we could do so safely. Remember poor Lou's arm. I already have a couple of billion years or so under my belt and have no desire to add more millennia." Romana looked as though she was about to take issue with something he had just said, but then appeared to reconsider. Instead, she said, "I suppose we can just wait here until the animals naturally disperse as they wander the castle in search of us. Then we can make a dash for the front door, unbolt it and try and find some transport back to Buda Aerodrome." Before the doctor could give his appraisal of her plan, they were both distracted by a sudden shift in the lighting. Above them, hidden until now by passing clouds, 3 glowing discs of various colors and sizes appeared in the near-black sky. "Aha," the doctor said with an air of an authoritarian tour guide. "The triple moons of Hung area. It's quite rare to see them in such close proximity." Their attention was broken by a horrified cry from behind them. "The eyes of Satesh!" This outburst had come from Akos, the steward of Visegrad Castle. The doctor frowned at him. "What on Gallifrey's wrong with you?" he demanded, his disguise momentarily slipping. "They're just moons. You must see them all the time." Akos was now shaking and quivering uncontrollably with something beyond fear. "You don't understand," he whimpered desperately, wringing his tremulous hands. "When they are like that, close and staring, they bring the curse." "What are you talking about?" the doctor demanded, taking a step towards the quaking servant. Akos, in his turn, raised up a clawing hand to ward him off. "Stay back!" he shouted. "Dr. Nugati did something to us," he continued in a tortured whine. "Not the thing he did to those beasts out there, or others of his servants from other places, or even himself. No, we did not die only to come back, although perhaps death might be preferable." The quivering of his body increased in intensity as he stared up at the triple moons. It almost seemed as if he were growing in stature, his clothes becoming tighter. He spoke again, although his words were almost growled, as if he struggled to get them out. Centuries ago, this land, these people were cursed by raging beasts, damned and uncontrolled. We thought them defeated long ago, the curse lifted. But Nugati injected all who live within the castle with another of his accursed concoctions, a different one from that he used on himself. Aided by Satesh, the curse is reborn. This last phrase really did sound like a roar, Arkosh raising his face up towards the ceiling as he made it. His clothes ripped, those on his upper body becoming nothing but shreds, while his trousers barely fared any better, only held together in small part by their overstretched leather belt. Now his gaze lowered to regard the two Time Lords, giving them their first full view of his transformation. While he still had Albion or Hungarian aspects to his appearance, he was now well over 7 feet tall. He had also gained in muscle mass quite considerably, and had also acquired a quite un-Albion quantity of body hair. He seemed a complete fusion of person and animal. "You've got to be kidding," Romana said flatly. "He's a werebear." As if in response, the man-beast charged at Romana and the doctor, who in turn ran to the other side of the sarcophagus to avoid his initial attack. Just then there was a crash of scraping metal and splintering wood. Peeking out from one side of the coffin, the doctor's head just above Romana's, they saw the double doors of the exhibition room had been smashed in and partly off their hinges. Through this wreckage strode 2 more figures of unusual height and breadth. While once they had clearly been servants like Arkosh, now they were people no more. Their clothes had suffered a similar fate to that of the steward. The tatters which remained could not disguise what they had become. One now bore distinctly lupine features, whilst the other was more ruddy and vulpine. The werewolf and werefox thudded over to stand shoulder to shoulder with the werebear. Romana turned her head to look up at the doctor. "I don't suppose you have a plan for this?" she asked, betraying little hope. The doctor shook his head, tutting. "O ye of little faith," he remonstrated. Romana raised an eyebrow. "Well?" The doctor took a deep breath. "Romana? Yes? Run."
Masters, mistresses, the Doctor requires materials in order to maintain the TARDIS and ensure continued functionality. He similarly requires carbon-based comestibles to sustain his own biological functions and existence. Master would never say this, but he requires aid beyond that supplied by this unit in order to acquire these. To aid the Doctor in his various tasks and creations, this can be most effectively achieved via Patreon or Substack subscriptions, or through donations directly to PayPal. Or if you desire physical goods in return for your contributions, written accounts of my travels with the Doctor are also available on Amazon. Links are in the description below. Thank you, Masters, mistresses.